Welcome to Hydrogen Rising, a bi-weekly podcast created and hosted by the global law firm K&L Gates that brings you analysis of critical, cutting-edge issues impacting the global hydrogen market. We look forward to your engagement and feedback. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you have ideas about new topics you'd like us to cover.
Welcome back to Hydrogen Rising, everyone. I'm David Walkner, a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of the global law firm K&L Gates, and co-lead our firm's global hydrogen practice. As I expect all of you have noticed, and we've received some emails from you over the last couple of months, we did take a little bit of a break over the summer, but we are back just in time to address some really exciting developments in the hydrogen sector. And of course, I'm saying we, and I am referring to my awesome co-host and longtime friend, Sandy Safro, who is the Associate General Counsel at the Edison Electric Institute. Sandy, fantastic to be back in the recording studio with you.
Yeah, you too, David. And as folks know, our recording studio is more virtual than physical. And so today I am actually coming to you from the University of Madison in Wisconsin. And so if you hear people walking around in the background or vacuum cleaners or whatever else, I'm sitting in an academic building at the moment. I'm here for EEI's Transmission School, which has been super helpful for me. And I actually taught a session this morning on hydrogen. So it continues to be an interesting topic for folks across the spectrum.
Yeah, and outstanding. I mean, transmission is going to be such a huge issue, of course, as we are looking to deploy more renewable energy in order to bring more clean hydrogen online across the United States. So all very, very timely. I'm really excited today for our guest, someone who Sandy and I both know very well, work very closely with, and are fortunate enough to call a friend too. My partner here at K&L Gates, Elizabeth Crouse, who is based in our Seattle office and co-leads our global power practice. Elizabeth's practice in particular focuses on renewable project development and in particular focus on tax strategies and tax structuring strategies for the deployment of renewable and clean energy projects. And so given the significant news over the last couple of weeks that I think everyone is now aware of, the kind of now fabled Schumer-Manchin Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, which has now created a really exciting opportunity, I think, for clean energy deployment. Given all of that, we are incredibly excited to have Elizabeth join us today to talk about the provisions in the IRA that will impact the hydrogen industry and what that's going to look like, and some things for all of you to be thinking about out there, all of our Hydrogen Rising listeners. So, Elizabeth, welcome to Hydrogen Rising.
Thank you. And can I just say, welcome to the revolution?
That's right. It's a
revolution in
tax revolution, right?
Yeah.
And actually, that's kind of amusing because I think most people think tax lawyers, y'all are boring or something, right?
No, we're not.
This is a revolution. I'm excited you started with that. So let's just kick off with the basics. Without getting into the politics of all of it, just give us a sense on the Inflation Reduction Act. What does it do in broad strokes for clean energy and the energy industry?
Yeah, it is really rather revolutionary in terms of how our tax credit structures work. Okay, we've been operating under a system that has been, in renewable electricity in particular, it's been operating for over the last decade in basically the same way, right? Pretty established, pretty almost cookie cutter, frankly, in how we approach these transactions. What the IRA does is it not only extends some existing credits, expands some existing credits, but it also fundamentally changes how we structure tax credits going forward. There's some very interesting and novel techniques here where some tax credits are going to be tied to greenhouse gas emissions at the national level. And then we also have changes in terms of how you get to the maximum credit rate, i.e., by reference to things like prevailing wages and apprenticeship requirements, location in what we're calling energy communities, which is basically places in the country that have historically been reliant on oil, gas, and coal. So it's very much a departure from the norm. It's very complicated, but it is also really interesting because it fundamentally changes how we think about tax credits. And one of the things that I haven't mentioned yet, which is perhaps one of the more revolutionary aspects of it, is we're going to have a lot of different structure possibilities coming out of this. There are a couple of provisions in there that we're calling direct pay and transferability, which basically impact a lot of the structuring choices, frankly. So we could be seeing a significant expansion of the market, maybe not in the ways that people initially thought, but in very exciting ways.
Thanks. That's a fantastic starting point for us. And I really like the way you talk about that, kind of changing the way we think about tax credits and changing the way we're able to structure potential transactions. I think that's a good starting point. Sandy?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, reading through the text of the act and just kind of thinking about where we stand with the development of a hydrogen economy at scale in the United States and the provisions of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that relate to hydrogen, which includes the development of the regional clean hydrogen hubs, and then, of course, some dollars for electrolysis programs. There's been, I think, a lot of talk around, what about the tax incentives, right? We had Build Back Better, and it was really great to see the provisions of this legislation kind of move through the Senate and the House. And so maybe just to pivot a little bit and dive in on hydrogen, can you outline for us what some of the basic principles are of the new Section 45V as in Victor, which is the clean hydrogen production tax credit?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, first of all, right now we have tax credits for hydrogen. We didn't before, which is kind of a major change. The basic provision here is the production tax credit, like you mentioned, but there's also an election to convert into an investment tax credit, which is sort of like what solar has been using for a lot of years. The basic point of the hydrogen credit really is production tax credit. It's based on production of hydrogen, okay? Congress has said in the statute that, look, we care about the greenhouse gas emissions of the hydrogen. So there are thresholds in here. And that very much impacts the amount of credit that you get, just as your base credit. And then you get adders or bonuses or whatever you want to call them for hitting other targets like wage and apprenticeship requirements, et cetera. So no different than a lot of the other general provisions in here. A couple of really big things about this credit, though, really interesting things. One is that the statute specifically refers to the Clean Air Act and the GREET model, that's GREET. GREET model that's produced by Argonne National Labs, and it's saying that we're going to use that for purposes of determining life cycle GHG emissions. There are a lot of different things in here. One, the tax law is using 4 kilograms as a threshold amount, 4 kilograms of CO2e per kilogram of hydrogen, okay? That's different than the IIJA. We can talk about that a little bit later. The other thing that's really interesting is that they don't specify which GREET model, right? I understand from people who are much smarter than me in the consulting field that the GREET model changes every year. And not only that, but there are a lot of different iterations at the state level, and different organizations have their own models. The statute just says Argonne. And so we don't know if IRS is perhaps going to specify, California GREET model or something like that in regulations. We also don't know for sure if it's going to change every year. The statute isn't quite as clear about that as it could be. So again, regulations and the regulation process are going to be really important here. The other thing, though, that the statute says, which is super exciting to me, is that in terms of life cycle GHG emissions, they talk about essentially well to gate. And they say specifically that the measurement stops at the point of production. And because it's a hydrogen credit, that tells me that what Congress wants is the GHG or CI score for the hydrogen, not for whatever you produce with the hydrogen. And that's important because this credit, unlike the traditional production tax credit for electricity, says that you can get the credit if you sell the hydrogen to somebody or if you use it. What does that mean? You can go use the hydrogen to power your fleet. Sure, go ahead. Or your electric plant, whatever. But you can also convert it to ammonia. You can also convert it to e-methane. And that's really exciting because I can still get the credit for that, even though it's not specifically called out in the statute. That could be really revolutionary for as we transition to a renewable fuel base, simply because those things are expensive. And if you have to account for the CI score for the production into e-methane, well, you're probably going to blow your 4 kilogram max. The other thing about the production tax credit that's really interesting is this option to switch over to the ITC. Some of these facilities are pretty expensive. If you switch to an investment tax credit from production tax credit, that can actually help you get a facility built. Now, usually production tax credits are better, right? Because they're available for 10 years. The investment tax credit is available once whenever you place the facility in service. It's a trade-off, right? And you need to run through your financial model to figure out what's better for you.
So that's great, Elizabeth. Let me just ask, I appreciate all of those, and there's definitely a number of threads we want to pull in follow-up questions, but I want to make sure that we get for our listeners too, what the actual tax credit is. So is there, I understand there's like a ratcheting mechanism, as you said, based on the carbon intensity. So what does that look like?
That's right. So the base rate is 60 cents per kilogram of clean hydrogen, okay? That gets reduced with your ratchet mechanism based on how clean your hydrogen is. And so if, for example, you're between 2.5 and 4 kilograms of CO2e per kilogram of hydrogen, you only get 20% of 60 cents per kilogram. Okay, so it changes your base rate. In order to get the maximum base rate of 60 cents per kilogram, you need to be between 0 and 0.44 kilograms of CO2e per kilogram of hydrogen. Okay, that's pretty low. It's pretty low.
And would mean that if you're producing hydrogen from natural gas, for example, you're absolutely, you have some sort of mitigation technology or carbon capture or something like that associated with it.
Absolutely. And you are allowed to use carbon capture to reduce your CI score for this. It's expressed in the statute.
Great.
Bear in mind, though, that the well to gate mechanism does mean that you need to account for leakage, for example, at the well. So that's going to be important to keep a handle on. But under the current GREAT model, wind or solar or other electrolytically produced hydrogen may actually be in a better spot, just because right now, anyway, I understand that the CI score for the process of manufacturing things like turbines and solar panels and so forth isn't taken into account. The credit rates can also be increased. Okay. So you start at their 60 cents. You ratchet down for a high CI score. You get 60 cents if you're at a good low score. Then it can also be increased by 5x in order to meet the wage and apprenticeship bonus requirements. And it also can be increased to account for a few other programs that are not going to be as widely available.
I think you covered this in the beginning part, but I just want to ask you a little bit more specifically. When you talk about this being focused on production, is there an accounting for where your energy inputs come from? So, for example, if we're talking about electrolytic hydrogen, are we looking at whether the electricity that's used to power the electrolyzer comes from a renewable resource versus the grid versus something else? Or is it really just we're looking at the site where you're producing the hydrogen and, just considering that part of the process?
Yeah, it specifically talks about life cycle and using the GREAT model up to the point of production. And so I understand that, so the electricity itself, if you're doing electrolytic hydrogen, the electricity itself doesn't matter where you get it. It could be brown power from the grid. That's fine. But what you're going to have to ask yourself and your consultants is, how does that fit into my GREAT model? Okay. That's what's going to be the key there.
And presumably there's some sort of, again, we're not consultants who do that kind of work, but presumably there's some sort of benchmark or normalization that they would use in saying you're pulling grid power, which could be renewable, it could be gas-fired generation, we don't know where it comes from.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Exactly. It's just going to come down to the GREAT model. And again, IRS regulations, it's going to be really important to make sure that you take advantage of the opportunity to comment on the regulations when they come out in proposed form. One other thing, though, about the input of electricity is that the statute also provides that you can get tax credit for the renewable electricity that you own and that's used to power your electrolyzers. So if you've got a solar facility that's powering your electrolyzers, you can get a credit for the solar facility and the hydrogen, which is nice.
That's great. So is there the ability to stack those, or if you take one, you can't take the other?
You can stack them. You cannot stack the 45Q carbon capture credit if you're using natural gas, but you can stack the renewable electricity credits with the hydrogen credit.
That's great. And just, you mentioned 10 years, but I just want to clarify for listeners the duration of the credit. Right. I know that, as you pointed out, one of the challenges for years has been that we had the ITC and PTC and they expired each year. And so investors aren't willing to put the money in if they don't know if the tax credit is going to be renewed by Congress. Lots of talk about extenders over the years, right? So what does that look like now going forward? What kind of certainty do investors and project developers have?
So the hydrogen credits become available in respect of hydrogen that's produced after December 31, 2022. That's for the production tax credit. The ITC will begin to apply for facilities that are placed in service next year. And then the production tax credit continues to be available in respect of hydrogen that's produced by facilities, the construction of which begins before January 1, 2033. That's a lot to unpack.
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay.
So what we mean is if my client, or maybe me, if I should be so lucky, starts building a hydrogen production facility in 2032, whenever that thing is done and starts to produce hydrogen, I'm going to get hydrogen PTC in respect to that hydrogen that I'm producing for 10 years after I start producing the hydrogen.
Okay.
So the normal development cycle, frankly, the hydrogen PTC could be available well into the 2040s.
Wow, that's exciting.
It's super exciting. Super exciting.
So, Elizabeth, I guess with all of the factors that you've just talked about in terms of the amount of the tax credit, the sort of scope of availability of it, the duration of the tax credit, from your experience, do you see what's in the IRA as being sufficient to really help spur development in the hydrogen industry? Or do you think that there are other things that we maybe still need to be putting on the table and moving forward?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really good and solid step forward. We need a couple of things. We need good regulations. We need regulations that are responsive to how the industry really works and how project development really works. Now, we do have some precedent for some of these things. I mentioned beginning of construction. We've got really good precedent for that. I don't expect IRS to issue anything that's strange or weird or anything. But we do need guidance about, what bits and pieces of a hydrogen production facility will qualify for the ITC. We have solid ideas, but we don't have precise guidance. We need guidance about which GREET model to apply. Things like that, fleshing out the statute. But the way that they set this up, as far as particularly the duration and tying duration to when a facility begins construction, I think is really great. And I think it does provide a lot of certainty, provides a lot of stability to an industry that badly needs it to get off the ground.
That's helpful. There's a couple other things that you briefly touched on in your opening remarks that are worth following up on. You talked a bit about this already, the 4 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen produced. Sandy and I, over the, since the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law in late 21, we've had several episodes on Hydrogen Rising about the impacts of that and looking at how that affects hydrogen projects. And so, as our regular listeners know, a significant part of that is the definition of clean hydrogen in the IIJA, and that is defined as hydrogen produced with GHG emissions of 2 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, 2 kilograms or less of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen produced at the site of production. You've walked us through the IRA already. We've got, would seem like a little bit of a conflict between these two, recognizing this is all new, right? We don't actually know how all this is going to play out. Considering that 90% of the world's hydrogen is currently produced from natural gas, like this distinction and conflict potentially has an impact on projects. So I'd be curious to get your initial reactions on how you think this conflict may play out a little bit for the hydrogen industry.
So I don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but this is going to be the topic of a lot of conversations. Basically, this disconnect, you kind of have to think about the process of producing hydrogen a little bit piecemeal, right? Mm. Number one, it's going to really depend on which GREET model we use. And if we have to take into account changes to the model in the future, which is not clear. So you kind of have to think about it in terms of, okay, what is my CI score at production? Okay. If that's low enough to fit under the IIJA, then I can move to the next step of, well, what's my CI score before I get to that point? You have to start adding up the numbers. And it's cumbersome and it's annoying. And I can only assume that there were different policy objectives behind the two. Because, of course, Congress does talk to itself on these things. Or at least I like to think they do.
Yeah. I'll note you live in the other Washington. You live in Seattle versus us in Washington, D.C. So we're perhaps a little more realistic here, Elizabeth.
Perhaps. Just call me naive. But at any rate, I think it's going to take a minute to just sort of process this. But my understanding is that most facilities that have to measure a CI score for any reason, they've got models that can be adapted, and we're just going to have to adapt them and think about it a little bit more comprehensively, unfortunately.
Yeah. So, Elizabeth, I wanted to pull on another thread of something you mentioned in your opening remarks. The Biden administration has been really focused in a number of its funding initiatives on labor, apprenticeships, and other ways of growing job opportunities for Americans. And I think you mentioned that there are wage and apprenticeship bonus provisions that are throughout the IRA. So can you talk a little bit about those and more specifically about how they would function in Section 45V, which again is the Clean Hydrogen Production Tax Credit section?
Yeah, absolutely. So the wage and apprenticeship requirements apply basically in order to get a realistic credit rate. Let me put it that way. Right now, we're in sort of a buy period where the statute is basically set up to say, hey, if you've already begun construction on a facility before that day that is 60 days after the IRS issues regulations on wage and apprenticeship, then you can basically ignore the wage and apprenticeship rules. That might be an option for some hydrogen facilities, but a lot of them haven't broken ground yet or even procured major equipment. So it's probably not realistic in the hydrogen industry to use that. So we really need to think about, well, what do we need to do in order to comply with these requirements? So there are two different sections here. One is wages. And generally speaking, what you're looking at are prevailing wages in whatever geographic area you're operating in during construction. And you're going to look at U.S. Department of Labor rules for that. U.S. Department of Labor wage statements. Apprenticeship is a little bit more complicated. Again, we're really looking at sort of the construction phase, generally speaking. But basically, there are a few different levers here. The way I think about it, because I have to go put a pen to a contract at some point, is I think about, I probably want both all of my taxpayer, my contractors, and all of my subs to have at least one apprentice who can work on this project. Because it's not that you need to have a ton of time spent by apprentices on the project, but there are some requirements in there essentially saying that each of those people, taxpayer, contractor, subcontractor, if you've got more than 4 people on staff, you have to employ at least one apprentice. So that's going to cover most contractors and even a lot of subs, frankly. So, you kind of have to boil it down to what you're going to put into a contract in my world anyway. And that's one of the things that I'm strongly considering just adding. These requirements do have a couple of areas where you've got a little bit of a buy at times. Like, for example, a lot of people were worried about the apprenticeship requirement because not all professions have apprenticeship programs, and you're still reliant in some cases on obtaining apprentices. And if there's not a strong apprenticeship program in your state, you might be high and dry. And that is recognized in the statute. There's sort of a good faith effort standard where if you've tried to get an apprentice and you can demonstrate that, then IRS is not going to hold you to the apprenticeship requirement. There is not that excuse, though, for the prevailing wages. So that's going to be really important to meet.
The apprenticeship thing is interesting. As you're aware, there are a lot of clean hydrogen hub concepts that are in formulation with the anticipation of bidding in the DOE program. And a lot of those have, I'm aware that a number of those hub proposals are bringing in as partners in the hub, local universities, maybe junior colleges, because they all recognize the need to build a workforce that is skilled and experienced. That might be a really smart alignment here, right? If you are a hub project to bring in a university or some kind of technical institution that can help train people to be those apprentices and to really, help you kind of get that bonus opportunity with the tax credit.
Absolutely. And, I think the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Association, which I'm involved with out here in Washington, also has some board members from some of the unions, too.
That's
great. Of course,
great.
Unions often run apprenticeship programs. So that's another way in which you can try to pursue that kind of a partnership.
It may be helpful here also just to talk a little bit more about the energy communities, because I think I realize it's not directly related to apprenticeships, but I mean, at least conceptually. So can you talk a little bit more about the energy community concept and sort of how that works with these tax credits?
Right. So the energy community concept here, it's a way to increase the amount of tax credit under both the production tax credit or the investment tax credit option for hydrogen. Basically, what an energy community is a brownfield within EPA requirements, or it's some kind of geographic area, and there are a few different definitions in here, but a geographic area that's been historically reliant on oil, gas, or coal. And the definitions that are in there have to do with, census tract, job data, and things like that. There's also a couple of categories for census tracts where you've got a coal plant or a coal-fired facility or a coal mine or something that's been shut down in the last 20 odd years. That's an interesting add, and I think it's really interesting for a couple of strategic reasons here. One, it may have helped, Senator Manchin out. I don't know. But also, one of the struggles that we've had with the energy transition is communicating with folks in parts of the country that have historically been reliant on gas and coal and so forth for jobs, and making sure that those people don't get left behind. That's a really important national priority. We don't want to leave our fellow citizens behind. And more to the point, those are parts of the country where there are great skills and good workforce.
Yep, absolutely.
And land.
Yep.
Right? And so if we don't try to encourage folks to go to some of those parts of the country and recognize the benefits that can bring, we're shortchanging all of it. We're shortchanging ourselves.
Yeah, and that is, it seems to me, it's really pulling through the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative, right? A big part of that
100%.
is focused on environmental justice communities, and certainly energy communities are part and parcel of that. Well, so maybe I would say, just in closing, you mentioned earlier the need for good regulations coming out of this. So what is next? I know you work very closely with a number of our colleagues here in DC, Mary Baker, who leads our tax policy practice, former IRS official who's been on the podcast before, Lori Purpuro, former senior DOE official who's been on the podcast before. What do you guys see as, what's next? How does implementation happen? Are projects going to get held up because they can't get clarification from Treasury? Like, what does that look like?
So a couple of things. One, IRS is going to start dropping regulations here pretty soon. Okay. They'll probably come out a little bit piecemeal because some things are higher priority than others, like the wage and apprenticeship rules, which apply to, I think, almost all of the credits in the IRS. A lot of people don't realize you can comment on Treasury regulations. And in fact, it's really important to do that. Because look, the IRS, contrary to what a lot of people think, they do actually care about making these programs work. And they want to make them work. It makes their life easier, but also, they're carrying out Congress's intent better, right? They do talk to industry. They care very much about what industry thinks. They want it to be practical and something that can be implemented. Part of that process is getting comments on the proposed regulations. Okay. And so the last time we had a major batch of regulations around tax credits was 45Q, which is the carbon capture production credit. There were reams of comments submitted on that. Reams. This is going to be even higher volume. So it's going to be really important to sit down, think about what you want as an industry, think about what you need in order to get a project built, and write the comments. Tell the IRS what needs to be in here in order to make this work. That process altogether, I'll be thrilled if we get final regulations on all of this within 12 months. It's not going to happen. It's going to take longer than that because there's a lot of regulations to write here. As far as what else is next, we need to continue the process of creating good hub plans. We've got that DOE program. It's just around the corner when applications are going to start opening up. And we need to make sure that the credits and the hub programs can mesh well to make sure that we can continue to advance the hydrogen industry.
I think that's great advice. I expect that, and certainly I would be remiss if I didn't say that you and Mary and others can help clients and help interested parties in the industry if they do.
I love writing comment letters.
File comments with the Treasury Department. Look, we're very grateful for you taking time. I know you're busy. You are advising a slew of folks on how to move forward now that this has been signed into law. Just want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today on Hydrogen Rising. Entirely my pleasure. Thank you. Sandy, thanks. It is great to be back with you. We'll get some more programming lined up in the coming weeks and be on a little bit more regular cadence for our listeners. I think you're getting some requests from folks as well that they want to see us back or hear us back in the mix.
I am, and it's always really flattering. So I'm really glad to hear that people are listening and finding the podcast helpful. I know you and I both really enjoy doing it, so it's really fun to be back in our virtual recording studio, and maybe we can do an episode we record in a joint place. It won't be a recording studio.
That's right. We'll line that up. I expect that'll be coming in the next few weeks. So. Great. Well, Elizabeth Crouse, thanks again for taking time to talk to us today. And thanks to all of our listeners out there for joining us on Hydrogen Rising. Don't forget, of course, to check out K&L Gates' market-leading publication, the Hydrogen Handbook, available on our website at klgates.com/hydrogen. And, of course, if you have questions about the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, that has just been signed into law and provides, as Elizabeth has outlined, great opportunities for the hydrogen industry, please don't hesitate to reach out to either Sandy or me, and, of course, our guest, Elizabeth Crouse, who's available on the K&L Gates website as well. With that, we will close out. Stay tuned for the next episode of Hydrogen Rising.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. Be sure to subscribe to receive timely notifications of future episodes and check out our market-leading publication, the Hydrogen Handbook, on our website at www.klgates.com.